Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from Kansas Soybean Commission, the soybean checkoff. It works for everyone.
I keep reading about engineered corn, but I don't know what that means.
Spring water, purified water, what's the difference?
Is imported beef safe for my family?
Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy. That's where Real Ag comes in. From plant to plant and from pasture to plate, Kyle Bauer and the Real Ag crew find the facts to help you sort the truth and help you understand Real Ag. Now here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
Water is a renewable resource, but it's not an infinite resource. A lot of people work hard to make sure that plenty of clean water is available to you when you need it. Welcome to Real Ag. I'm Kyle Bauer. Water is not just for people to drink. It's necessary for crops and livestock as well as industrial uses. It's important to strike a balance between them, a balance that includes quantity and quality.
You know, I think really when we talk about water, typically we're talking about either times of too much or too little with flood or drought. But I don't think that most people really understand the importance the water has in not only our everyday life of just sustaining life, but also to our economy, across every facet of our economy, whether it's our power production. Every power plant in the state is a steam-driven power plant and requires water for cooling, and so every time we turn on the lights, that's dependent upon water, to whether it's agriculture, where the entire irrigation community, the feedlot industry, is dependent upon water, especially in the western part of the state and the south central part of our state.
When we talk about water resources, we talk about two different kinds of water resources. Groundwater, that's the water that's stored below the surface, that's pumped up to the surface for use, and surface water. Surface water would include rivers and streams and lakes. Both are very important, but both have to be managed in completely different situations.
An aquifer is an underground body of water that produces water to wells, basically. There's underground water that's extractable. Clays have lots of water in them, but they don't yield water to wells. So you're typically looking at a sandy sort of formation that has water in it. Kansas has very significant water resources, mostly. I mean, there are two major types of water resources we have in Kansas. Obviously, the surface water resources that are in our streams and water courses, and then the groundwater resources that are part of the aquifers we have in our state. So the eastern Kansas tends to be dominated by surface water. We have less surface water in the west, and our groundwater resources, the most significant of those is our Ogallala High Plains that's underlying much of western Kansas.
So a watershed really is just the area that drains to any point along a stream. And so in this case, when we talk about a watershed for a reservoir, what we're talking about is any part of the land surface that when rain falls on it, it drains into that reservoir. And so if we look above any of our reservoirs, whether they're federal or private, you look upstream from the dam, you're going to see the area that drains into that reservoir, and that's really the watershed. And so what happens in the watershed, obviously water runs downhill when it rains, and so what happens in the watershed really has a big impact on what happens in the reservoir, whether that's sedimentation or whether it's nutrients, whether it's other issues, making sure that we have adequate water coming into the reservoir itself. All of that is dependent on what happens in the watershed. Well, Kansas really is fortunate to have a series of federal dams built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation starting in the late 40s and really going through the early 80s. Two different federal agencies, obviously one's within the Army Corps, the U.S. Army, the Corps of Engineers, primarily built in the eastern half to two-thirds of the state and primarily built for flood control. Kansas uses those dams and reservoirs for recreation, primarily a lot for water supply, for water quality purposes, and of course the original purpose of flood control.
Kansas is unique in that we really are almost two different states when you talk about water resources. The western portion of the state is mostly groundwater dominant, and the eastern portion of the state is mostly surface water dominant. So that really plays into a water planning process when you talk about conserving your resources. So in western Kansas, we have a really robust monitoring network that has identified and mapped out the decline of the Ogallala Aquifer over time. And what that's shown us is that it's just not one size fits all, that there are certain areas that really are almost at a sustainable level for future of carrying our economy, and other areas not so much. It's a very heterogeneous system so that not one place is similar to another. In eastern Kansas, where most things are surface water dominated, we have done similar assessments, just not looking at the groundwater wells, but instead looking at the yield of the supply that we get from our storage basins or our federal water supply reservoirs. And so in that way, we've been able to prioritize which basins might need some attention today in order to make sure that we have supplies that can meet our customers' demand into the future.
When we talk about water uses across the state, it basically breaks down into three major areas: agricultural, industrial, and residential uses. Agricultural uses breaks down into irrigation and livestock uses.
Availability of water is the critical component in locating any animal feeding operation. Without water and without the necessary permits from the State Division of Water Resources, it's just not possible to have a confined animal feeding operation.
Approximately 80% of the water use in the state is provided for irrigation or agricultural purposes.
Well, there's something on the order of 27,000 wells that are authorized for irrigation use currently. We have on the order of 32,000 water rights that have actually been developed and continue to remain active. You know, about 80% of those are irrigation water rights, and the rest of them are for other uses: municipal, industrial, stock water, and so forth.
Industrial use of water includes water for factories, water for food processing, cooling of power plants, and any other industrial use that isn't agricultural or residential.
Well, irrigation is the largest use, but municipal use, industrial use, domestic use, stock water use, hydropower are among the 15 different uses of water under the Appropriation Act.
Balancing agricultural and municipal industrial needs is always a tough balancing act. And I think maybe one of the places that we've got somewhat of a new and innovative approach is really in the area of Canopolis and down into the Salina region along the Smoky Hill River. In that case, again, the state of Kansas owns storage in Canopolis Reservoir, and there is a large irrigation community below Canopolis that is dependent upon releases during times of drought, as well as the city of Salina. And it's kind of a unique situation in that you have this significant irrigation community right next to a significant municipality, both dependent upon the same river and both dependent upon the same reservoir. And so there's a new approach to try and get both of those groups to be able to sit down at the table and work out the management of the reservoir, management of the river, and their different uses, and sit around the table during when we're not in a drought situation, and come up with an operational plan for when we are.
Residential use of water includes homes and gardens and private use of water like golf courses and your own garden at home.
Domestic use, I mean, there can be domestic from either surface water or groundwater, but domestic groundwater use you could use your well for your household use, for a garden up to 2 acres, for a limited amount of stock. Legally, under the Appropriation Act, all uses are the same. So it doesn't matter. The first water right gets the water first, no matter what the use is. Now, economically, some of the uses are more at an advantage. Municipal industrial uses are typically higher values, and so they can, at times when water, they can, for example, purchase water rights from irrigators and convert them to use. So there's, although all water uses are the same legally, economically, certain uses have an advantage.
Many of you may have heard about a water right. What is a water right? A water right is a legal document that allows you to use water for a beneficial use.
In Kansas, the allocation of water resources is governed by the Kansas Water Appropriation Act. That was passed in 1945, and so there were uses in place before then, and they were brought into that appropriation system. But since then, water is essentially allowed to be developed under a Water Appropriation Act. The Kansas Water Appropriation Act essentially says all the water of the state is for the use of the public of the state. A water right is essentially a right to use that public resource, and they're applied for to the Division of Water Resources. You have a specific use that you want to make of the water. It has a specific point of diversion, place of use, quantities and rates that are allowed to put that water to use.
As a residential user, you may be concerned that I don't have a water right. Do I need one? You don't. State law allows for residents to use water for their residential use without the need for a water right.
Yeah, domestic, the definition of domestic includes your house, a garden, up to 2 acres of garden, and some for stock water as well.
When we talk about regulating the quality and quantity of water across the state, the Environmental Protection Agency, a federal agency, sets down guidelines that are brought out with the Clean Water Act of 1972. There are many agencies that are involved with both the quantity and the quality of water. The Water Office coordinates all these agencies. Many of them are state, federal, and local agencies involved with keeping the water clean and available.
In identifying and coordinating our water quality issues, it's not something that just happens in a silo in the Kansas Water Office. It's coordinated with our other sister agencies, including the Kansas Department of Health and Environment and also the State Conservation Commission, but also at the federal level. Those water quality issues are addressed with the Environmental Protection Agency, and then even to some extent, where funding is available, other cooperators at the federal level, including the Army Corps of Engineers.
The state really works in concert with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to manage the federal reservoirs. Under a 1958 federal act, the state of Kansas purchased storage in 13 of the Corps of Engineer reservoirs, and we operate essentially a raw water utility, where we own the storage and then we have contracts primarily with municipal industrial customers, and we provide water supply out of those reservoirs. And so during low times, drought times, is really when the state has primary responsibility for determining what the appropriate release coming out of the reservoir is. When we get on the flood control side, that's primarily the Corps of Engineers' role. And so we work very well together to try and make sure that we operate the reservoir through the whole range of conditions we might see from flooding right on down to drought.
Large animal feeding operations technically are regulated by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In Kansas, the State Department of Health and Environment has the authority and for carrying out and implementing those permits.
When we talk about water conservation across the state, we're talking about conserving both the quality of the water and the quantity of the water. Keeping water clean is a major portion of the management of agricultural land and the management of agricultural livestock. Both of these issues are very tightly regulated.
Water quality issues in the state are identified through a pretty robust water quality monitoring network that's administered through the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. And what that is it's a monitoring network on our surface waters that we have historical data that we can compare to current and future data that allows us to identify times when we might have water quality impairments. And those impairments could be things like nutrient or E. coli or sedimentation. And then once we've identified that potential impairment, we carry that through a very similar process as the water planning process, where we educate the local citizens about that impairment and talk about what things that might impact for them at a local level, things like water treatment. Once we've identified that impairment and talked to the locals, it's carried forward to the next level, which is the Environmental Protection Agency. And that lays out a plan of how we're going to address that impairment in the future. In Kansas, we're very fortunate that we have a really great program in place at a local level that helps us treat or work on those impairments. And that's the RAPS groups, which are Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategies. These are stakeholder-driven, locally managed plans that identify the water resource concerns, usually water quality related, at a local level. And those citizen groups then develop their own plan of how they're going to address that impairment in the future. It could be things like that they want to install more riparian buffers or grass buffer strips. things that they think are going to work at a local level and be successful to the citizens in their basin. And then they pitch that plan for opportunities for funding to implement more best management practices in the future.
Animal feeding operations obviously create large amounts of solid manure as well as stormwater runoff from pen surfaces. 100% of that manure and runoff is required to be contained and managed. And in most situations, those are very valuable, nutrient-rich products. Large confined operations are required to have state-approved nutrient management plans. And a nutrient management plan is basically a plan to ensure that nutrients do not build up on the field surface, but are applied in a way that balances the crop need so that we don't have runoff from nutrients. So we're achieving the maximum crop benefit from the product and don't have any leaving the field surface and entering surface water.
Conservation is a state priority and always has been. Conservation first really came into play really within the Appropriation Act, and simply the fact of making sure that we keep water that comes into Kansas and be able to use it for a beneficial use, but also to make sure that as we use it, we're not being wasteful in our use. And so conservation is a very important factor just in our overall management. If we look for the long term, as we talk about other options for water supply, they get very expensive, whether it's building new reservoirs, whether it's dredging out existing reservoirs. Those all take millions of dollars. And so the first line of defense to try and make sure that we can prolong our life of our reservoirs and our water supply is to conserve water we have. And you can do that obviously with everyday activities within your house. Agriculture can certainly do that with better application of water through the irrigation system, better water management, so that we're not applying irrigation when the crop's not needing it, and those sorts of things so that we have more water during times of drought, but also that we are best using the water and producing the most goods and services with that water for our economy.
The agricultural industry has made huge strides in the last 40 to 50 years in tillage practices and conservation practices to prevent erosion. And preventing erosion eliminates sediment eroding, leaving the farm fields and entering waterways. And it's also regulated by the state. So limits of sediment are set for waterways, and that's then incumbent upon the agriculture industry to reach achievable limits and not exceed those state-set limits for sediment.
Well, we often get the question of whether or not western Kansas really will run out of water. And from a strictly pure standpoint, I don't think western Kansas will completely run out of water. But certainly what we will see over time is as the groundwater declines, we have less water available, then our economy is going to change. There is a significant portion of our economy in western Kansas that is dependent upon groundwater pumping, primarily through the irrigation and then the feedlot and dairy industries that are so prevalent in western Kansas that are high water consumption industries. And so as our availability of groundwater declines, then we're going to be transitioning from those high water consumption industries to something else. There will always be some water there for domestic use, for municipal use, but at some point, and it varies across the state, some areas are much sooner than others, we will see that change in the economy as the ability to pump large quantities of water declines.
When we talk about the storage of water, for the most part, we're talking about the eastern part of the state of Kansas. That's done in dams and reservoirs, which are man-made. After the water is stored in that is managed by the Water Office in assurance programs that assures flow in the rivers below those dams in dry times.
Every single reservoir that is a federal reservoir has flood control in the state, and obviously that serves to protect the people living downstream against damaging floods that we saw. And really, a lot of those were in response to the floods we saw in 35 in the Republican Basin and 51, which we saw in the eastern part of our state.
Flooding is a natural phenomenon, so reducing or stopping flooding probably isn't reasonable. But what we can achieve on a statewide level or regional level is identifying flood management or flood protection measures that can help make sure that we're prepared when flooding does occur. One of the things is our federal reservoirs, and even to some extent our levees or smaller impoundments. So our federal reservoirs in Kansas provide on average about $7 to $8 million in flood reduction benefits per lake every year. So making sure that those lakes are sustainable into the future and that sediment impacts don't impact our flood storage is very important for making sure that we still receive those flood reduction benefits into the future. In the same way, making sure that our levee systems are intact and that our smaller dams are sustainable into the future too is going to be important for making sure we receive those flood reduction benefits. In July of 2007, we received a pretty major flood in the Verdigris and Fall River areas. And flooding usually comes to people's attention as being a priority issue when the flooding occurs. And so that's when we saw in 2007 as a heightened local awareness and concern for impacts of flooding to their region. So one of the tools that has since been developed in response to the 2007 flood is the Kansas Biological Survey has looked at the use of LIDAR, which is light imaging data, and ranging, which is like a remote sensing tool. And they were able to use that remote sensing tool to identify the highest risk areas that are flood prone. And so using that data that the Kansas Biological Survey has evaluated, local municipalities or counties can identify areas that might be at a greater risk for flooding in the future and make decisions about road construction, other infrastructure, housing developments, and that kind of planning that might at least reduce the risk for flooding in the future.
In the western part of the state, the Bureau of Reclamation, which is within the Department of Interior, built a series of 7 dams, and most of those dams primarily were built for the purpose of irrigation. They also have flood control, which again is operating in concert with the Corps of Engineers dams, but they also typically have a project that they're serving that has a series of irrigation canals, laterals that serve any number of farmers downstream. And we use those, and that's primarily what the majority of our agricultural interest in federal reservoir system is with Bureau of Reclamation reservoirs. But then each one of them, again in the western part of our state, may have irrigation that serves an irrigation district, have municipal use. Wakanda, for example, has an irrigation district below it. City of Beloit gets water supply out of it, as does rural water districts. In the eastern part of our state, primarily recreation, again flood control, but water supply is a much bigger component of the multiple uses of reservoirs in the eastern part of our state. 2/3 of our population gets their water supply either primarily or as a backup from a federal reservoir. And so all of our large population centers, whether that's Wichita, Kansas City, Topeka, Manhattan, Junction City, all of those get their water supply either directly or backed up by federal reservoirs. And so these multipurpose projects really are very important to the economy of the state of Kansas and to our survival.
Water has been a precious resource across the state of Kansas since the inception of Kansas. We've managed the quantity and quality of water. Many of those regulations predated any federal agency, whether that was the Clean Water Act or storage of water on a federal basis.
Kansas really has a long history of being concerned about making sure we understand the conditions of water across the state. And in fact, Kansas partnered with the federal government through the U.S. Geological Survey clear back in 1895 to become the first state to measure stream flow across the state through a cooperative agreement 115 years ago. So that really, in a lot of ways, was a landmark approach that now is being copied by every state in the union. If you take that further, we've been measuring groundwater levels all across the state with Department of Agriculture and Kansas Geological Survey really since the 50s or 60s. Every single year there's folks out across the state measuring wells, primarily irrigation wells in the western part of the state. And then water quality obviously has been a key issue for us as well, and all of that is based on data that has been collected really since the Department of Health and Environment was established in the early 70s. And so at every step along the development of water throughout the history of Kansas, having good data and having an adequate monitoring network has been a key factor in making sure that we have good plans, we make good decisions, and we certainly have had a lot of cooperators at the federal level, state, and in the local level as well to make that happen.
Livestock operations in Kansas have a long history of being proactive in the areas of environmental and water quality. and have taken a proactive approach to environmental and water quality issues. In fact, we've had a regulatory program for animal feeding operations since 1968. So our state program predated even the U.S. Clean Water Act and efforts through EPA to regulate water quality. And those regulations really go beyond any certain size. In the state of Kansas, regardless of the size of the facility, if it's creating a pollution potential, the State Department of Health and Environment has the jurisdiction and the authority and the program in place to require controls and permits and the necessary steps be put in place.
That wraps up this episode of Real Ag. We hope that the information presented here helps you understand the complexities of water. On behalf of the Real Ag crew, I'm Kyle Bauer, helping you sort the truth and helping you understand Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from Kansas Soybean Commission. The soybean checkoff. It works for everyone.